Many issues in fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics are rooted in decisions surrounding the data collection, annotation, and ownership practices. In the first part of this tutorial, I gave a bunch of examples, but I'll recap them really quickly. For example, I gave this example of from Gender Shades, which is work by Gebru and I, showing the high disparities in error rates among gender classification systems. So these are systems that take a picture of a person in them, and they try to classify the picture as containing a male or a female binary. And we found that the darker and darker the skin tone, the higher and higher the error rates, and the highest disparities in error rates are between lighter skinned men and darker skinned women. So here you see for Face++ and IBM, you reach almost random chance the darker and darker the skin tone. And so many companies responded to this work by releasing new data sets, like IBM, for example, and Microsoft also changed their API so that it doesn't have this kind of disparity anymore. Amazon may be audited, and there were a few changes in laws as well. But I think I tried to raise the complexity of doing this because, for example, IBM had to take down diversity in faces because many of us use Flickr in computer vision, but we have to understand that when people put their images out on Flickr, they're not necessarily imagining that it'll be used in face recognition products. And I try to describe the fact that even though Microsoft said that they have low disparities in error rates anymore, this task of gender recognition should not really even exist because many people, especially in the trans community, have written about the harms of this kind of classification. So this is actually a task that shouldn't even exist. And then, of course, at Google, they took into the heart the fact that we have to make sure that everything works for darker skinned people as well. But then the way they were doing this was trying to collect more images of people from darker skinned, and this was done the news reported that this was done in a predatory manner. And even the governmental agency NIST whose job is to evaluate these kinds of systems for accuracy, have been using data from the most vulnerable groups of people. And I think Emily's going to talk about categorization later, but this talk, Counting the Countless, is one of many other talks that talks about just the harms in classifying people in general, because many of the people at the margins, many of the people for whom these classifications have not worked, are always going to be harmed by a classification system. And so I suggest you read a book called Sorting Things Out, or this talk, Counting the Countless, to understand these perspectives. I also talked a little bit about another example of when people are trying to diversify data sets, how they do it, right? So I think a lot of people in the computer vision industry have now gotten the message that you need to have more diverse data sets to avoid having high disparities in error rates. But the way in which you diversify these data sets can have numerous negative consequences for many groups of people. In this case, Zimbabwean faces were being harvested without their consent, and Zimbabweans didn't really, this is not the thing that is something that was, to their benefit, and their faces were being collected without their consent. So to recap, sometimes you need to make sure that there aren't disparate error rates across subgroups. So if we were to do something like melanoma detection, we want to make sure that this melanoma detector works for people in every gender, age, geographic location, skin type, etc. But then sometimes the task just should not exist. So one example is automatic gender recognition. And then sometimes the manner in which the tool is used is very problematic because who has the power? And most of the time here it's data and ability to train powerful models versus who is subjected to those models. And I do a lot of work on face recognition, but right now, especially given the protests and what's happening to my community, to the Black community, it's very timely to talk about it. People ask, sometimes it's not so straightforward what tasks should exist and what tasks should not exist, right? So for example, automatic gender recognition, it's very straightforward for people in the trans community because they're directly harmed by it to say that this is a task that's harmful to them. But somebody who has never been harmed by those kinds of systems might not have the same perspective. And again, in face recognition, people ask, why should we care about face recognition? What's the problem? Because people recognize faces, right? And so my point is that technology does, it just amplifies our intent. So if our intent is to discriminate against people, technology can really amplify that, right? So this example was an example of in a magazine that was trying to educate people in the US how to distinguish between Chinese people and Japanese people. This was during World War II. And the point being that we should, target Japanese people, but not Chinese people. And so now this is being done at a really large scale, right? So you have people being targeted, Muslim minorities being targeted in China. And we have many Black people being targeted in the US. 1 in 2 American adults is in a face detection database, in a face recognition network. And most of the people who are targeted are Black and brown neighborhoods, as we can see in the protests right now. I gave in the first part of this lecture an example of Baltimore police, for example, during the Freddie Gray protests, using face recognition on protesters, trying to match it to their social media profiles, and then targeting those people for other arrests. So this is what I mean by who has data and power and who doesn't. So this, I recommend for people to read this report, this perpetual lineup report from Georgetown Law, and a follow-up report, America Under Watch. And I also talked about the fact that there is a very almost no intersection between the people who advocate for these technologies and sell them to tech companies and benefit from it and get rich and famous or get tenure or whatever it is, and academics versus the people who are actually harmed by this technology, which is in many places Black and brown people, and in the US and in Europe. And I mean, I was saying, I had a podcast where I gave a message about recent events that racism is a global phenomenon. It just depends on how it manifests itself. And of course, in different places, there are different kinds of dimensions along which people are marginalized. So I do believe that in our research, we cannot ignore social and structural problems, which is why I co-founded Black in AI, along with my colleague Radit Abebe. And this organization, I give other examples in the past, in the last lecture, but this organization, one of the things that I'm happy about is that people who almost wanted to leave, who almost left the tech industry because of marginalization, who stayed because we gave them support, subsequently did lots of important work showing biases in face recognition tools, for example, that are used by law enforcement, that are sold by Amazon to law enforcement. And one of these people is Deborah Raji. And then, of course, in our quest to address ethics and fairness, which are now everybody's now talking about it, we just can't have that without representation. I mean, we've understood this in our data sets, and now we haven't, though, transferred it to the people, right? The people protesting outside in the US are Black people, and the people who have shown the disparities in error rates on face recognition are Black people. The people who are disproportionately being affected are Black people, but we don't see them in leadership positions or being represented in all of these ethics or other kinds of panels or platforms. So that was just a brief recap of all the things that could happen, and many of them are rooted in society and data. And data is basically supposed to reflect society. this paper from Ken Holstein and his collaborators at Microsoft Research says, while fair ML, so they did a surveys of industry professionals, practitioners, to ask them what they need in kind of working on fairness in machine learning. And they said, while the fair ML literature has largely focused on debiasing methods and viewed the training data as fixed, most of our interviewees report that their teams consider data collection rather than model development as the most important place to intervene. And so we need a whole specialty in machine learning just dealing with data. We don't teach that in classes. Even when you're publishing in conferences, you know, there's always like this kind of inferiority about writing a data set paper. It's not really respected very much, and most people, a lot of reviewers will write, you know, oh, this is just a data set paper. I mean, even recently we had to say something when people were talking about breakthroughs in machine learning, and they got rid of, you know, they didn't have ImageNet in the timeline as a breakthrough. So there's this attitude that data is just something that's just given to you, and you should, you know, just work on interesting algorithms using this data as a benchmark. But actually, the most important part of this whole thing is data, and how we represent the world in this data, and how we collect this data, and whose data is being represented in what way. And so, and we don't really, you know, we don't respect that type of work, and we're not training anybody in our field to respect this kind of work. And so in this paper called Lessons from Archives, Strategies for Socio-Technical Machine Learning, Ansoo Zhou, and who is a PhD student, a history PhD student at Stanford University, and I talk about some ways in which, for example, the archives, we can learn from history. Because archives they're just the oldest field that deals with human-centric data, and so they have very rigorous processes for dealing with data. And I think I've tried to kind of really quickly discuss many of the issues that have to do with data that are complex. So that's consent. So for example, I gave the example of Flickr, right? Sure, the license allows you to use this data, but did people really think that this data was going to be used in that way when they put it out there? Power, which is who has the power to use this data and who doesn't, and who's benefiting from collecting data on whom. Inclusivity is how people are represented in their actual data set, and who is represented in the data set. Same with representation. Subgroup classification and annotation, again, like how do you define different subgroups? So in our work on gender shades, we talked about skin type and we talked about gender, and so, but there are so many different subgroups. And how do you do this annotation? How do you do this classification? Of course, privacy and ethics and transparency. So how do you convey the motivation of creating this data and the manner in which it was created, and the you know, kind of like tools to help people reproduce this process anyways. So one quote that's really important, again, is to remember that data sets involve subjects and objects and many times humans. And as computer vision researchers, we kind of tend to forget that. We kind of reduce humans to numbers. And so I want to highlight again this project called Our Data Bodies Project. And I really like this project because it's one of the few projects that specifically aligns itself with people from marginalized groups, right? Their day-to-day activity, their day-to-day conversation is with people in marginalized groups. Whereas many researchers and many practitioners, we're not paid by people in marginalized groups. We don't really present our work, we're not promoted or advanced because of our relationship to people in marginalized groups. But on the other hand, this happens for us because of our relationship to power. So our incentive structures are very different. So in the project, they say why we're concerned about data. And they say many things about, you know, database technologies are changing our lives, but they say this work is important because our data is our stories. When our data is manipulated, distorted, stolen, or misused, our communities are stifled and our ability to prosper decreases. So Sita Pena Gangadharan is one of the people who is involved in this project, and she gave this keynote at iClear that I recommend everybody reads. watches. And she says, people are caught in a never-ending cycle of disadvantage based on data that was collected on them. So she gives a few examples of stories. One is, Jill says, I pled guilty to worthless checks in 2003, 15 years ago, but this is still being held against me. All of my jobs have been temporary positions, because she gets a job, and then if they find out about this, then she might lose her job, right? Or she won't get a job because of this. Is this really fair? And no matter what kind of fair machine learning we create, is this practice fair? And then Sita talks about refusal. People refuse to settle for the data-driven systems, process of data collection systems that were handed to them. So Mello fought tooth and nail to find housing. She was repeatedly denied housing, had witnessed the death of her friend, had witnessed all sorts of atrocities. And she had a sense that this was why she was being denied housing. And each time she reapplied for housing, she was denied. So she challenged the data that was used to categorize her as someone who who does not need housing or should be denied housing. And another example is Ken, a Native American man who deliberately misrepresented himself so that the police couldn't find his name in a database. And so they issued him a ticket without a surname. Ken was practicing refusal against database-dependent police practices. Sita, ironically, she came to, she was very heavily involved in a conference that I'm involved in called FACT. And we created this conference, it's called FACT, stands for Fairness, Accountability, Transparency in Socio-Technical Systems. And this conference was created it's an interdisciplinary conference in computing. So it was created with the understanding that we cannot really address these issues of fairness, accountability, and transparency in a manner without being interdisciplinary. And so this conference was specifically targeted at working on this problem in an interdisciplinary way. And Sita came and she said, I've heard computer scientists present their research in relation to real world problems as if computer scientists and their research is not done in the real world. I listened to papers that tended to disappear people into mathematical equations. Marginalized people are demonized, deprived. What's the point of making data-driven systems fairer if they're going to make institutions colder and more punitive? So in our technical world, a lot of times we just kind of abstract away the real world, and then we try to figure out how to make some abstracted thing fairer and using some metric. But we don't really think about the manners in which these data-driven systems are used in our work, right? So I gave a few examples of people in marginalized groups, and many times these people in marginalized groups are demonized, like Sita says, right? They are kind of the stories that are told about them, like the stories that are being told about people protesting right now, are by the people who have power are very different. So for example, the late Toni Morrison says, I admire the patience that people have had for so long. They were waiting for justice for so long, and they didn't loot for so long. No one talks about that. Whereas you watch TV and they talk about looting, property damage, and that's the thing that's considered crime. But the injustices that have happened in the US and around the world against Black lives are not really the things that have been considered crime. And so again, marginalized people are demonized.